Hello, welcome to this week's Talking Europe, brought to you from the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Now, we may be in Alsace, but our minds are very much in more exotic locations this week. Panama, Barbados, the tiny Marshall Islands and more. These places have more in common than just fine weather and sandy beaches, though. According to a new list drawn by European lawmakers, they're among the world's biggest tax avoidance and money laundering destinations. In today's debate, we're asking how big the problem really is, who's on the list, and what impact it all might have. I'm joined by two members of the European Parliament who've spent many months investigating all of this for a report that itself was sparked by the revelations in the so-called Panama Papers leaks. So we're joined by rapporteur Peter Ježek from the Czech Republic, and you're with the ALDE, the Liberal Alliance in the European Parliament. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And also investigating this, shadow rapporteur for the Greens group, Molly Scott-Cato, MEP from the UK. Nice to meet you too.
Hi.
Thanks for being with us. Well, let's start off then with the report itself. There's a lot in there. Obviously, like I said, it comes out of the Panama Papers revelations. Can you tell us, Peter, what were some of the key findings that came out of it for you? Were you surprised at the scale of the money laundering and tax avoidance?
Well, yeah, to some extent I was surprised. Well, we've been working for 1.5 years and we at the end came up with a report on the findings of the committee and then the recommendations. And there are around 200 of the recommendations. And we concentrated on the EU legislation and whether it was properly implemented and enforced. And when it comes to the enforcement, for example, we recommend to the member states to reinforce significantly their financial intelligence units which fight against money laundering and tax avoidance.
I think the important word there is recommend, and that it's the member states. We'll probably come back to that a little bit later on. We definitely will, in fact. Molly, when we were speaking just before, you told me that you found some accounts that it is staggering, really, to think that people would set up accounts in the name of Donald Duck, that kind of thing.
I think we were all quite shocked about what we found. We were really looking, I would say, at the sort of seamy underbelly of global capitalism. You know, obviously the Panama Papers, it started off with hundreds of thousands of companies registered in offshore islands, you know, maybe 100 or more companies in one small building, just letterbox companies. I think you call them plaque companies in French, you know, but basically companies that have no economic existence there. They're simply there because they can pay much lower rates of tax. And this was the scandal that precipitated us into our 18 months of work. And I think we've really all been quite shocked about how bad it gets. As you say, you know, we've got accounts, we've got companies registered in the name of people who've been dead for 10 years. We've got companies registered in the name of, various Walt Disney characters. Unbelievable things going on. Which just demonstrates that the people who should be regulating the flow of capital across the world are not doing their job properly.
And so we're talking about recommendations and actions that can be taken. One of the headline actions that's come out of all of this, not just the Panama Papers, but also the Paradise Papers recently as well. We've got this now, a new blacklist and a grey list, as it's called, of countries that's been published by the European Commission. I spoke to Valdis Dombrovskis, Vice President of the European Commission, just a few days ago, and he told us a bit more about how those lists were drawn up.
This is a list which was set by the EU member states. So it's a council which is to explain why one or another legislation or country ended or didn't end up in the list. In any case, this was a process where the letters were sent to many countries. They went through the screening process. They came with a specific commitments, and based on this, member states eventually decided which countries are on a blacklist and which countries are in commitments list and which are not.
So there we go. European Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis explaining those new blacklists, grey lists to us. Peter Ježek, if I come back to you, this is a first, publishing these lists, being hailed as a victory by many people. However, there are quite a lot of notable omissions. For example, the British Virgin Islands is flagged up in your report as one of the main destinations for this kind of financial misdeed. Not on the blacklist. Is it a victory or is it a bit of a failure?
Well, it's a bit of both, I'd say. It depends whether you want to look at the glass, whether it's half full or half empty. But as you rightly say, it's the first list ever, the first EU list, which is more powerful, much more powerful than lists of individual member states. I think that's a qualitative step forward. Then almost 100 countries were scrutinized. Some 47, I think, out of them promised to implement measures needed. And at the end, 17 countries appeared on the list. We can speculate that the countries you mentioned could be there, but I hope that when the list is updated, the criteria will be followed, and the list will be reliable. I cannot say because I don't think it's my task to scrutinize all the countries in parallel to number of civil servants and ministers of finance, but I'm glad that there are criteria and the process has been launched and it has some momentum and dynamics.
All right then, Molly Scott-Cato, it's a good start then, or is it actually, perhaps as Oxfam I think said, picking on little easy targets such as Namibia and Mongolia?
There were some quite surprising countries on there, and I actually agree with Peter, it's not our job to organise this list as parliamentarians, but on the other hand I think it is important that you have some scrutiny, and we've suggested in our report that we should be able to have some oversight as the European Parliament, because what happens is there are some criteria. It starts off as quite an objective process, but then it gets into the Council, and the countries there try and make sure their particular favourite tax havens, dare I say, are not on the list at the end, and so countries that don't have any big friends, like Mongolia, might end up on the list, whereas as you pointed out, the British Virgin Islands is not. Now, to some extent, I think the Caribbean countries, where a lot of the tax havens are, especially the British overseas territories, have got off lightly because they've had hurricanes, and quite reasonably, it's been said, well, you haven't had time to respond. So that will be coming back, I think, in about 6 months. So maybe we will see the British Virgin Islands joining the other countries then. And also, we should remember that the Mossack Fonseca company just happened to favour the British Virgin Islands. You know, if we'd been somewhere else, it might have been Bermuda, as we saw with the Appleby leaks, or Cayman. So in a sense, it's not objective what came out in the Panama Papers. That was a bit random. But at the same time, we know that Britain's got a big problem with its overseas territories, and one of the things we're arguing particularly strongly with Brexit in process is that we must not allow the City of London to continue to operate in the same way, and we must make sure that we constrain the bizarre relationship between the City of London and Britain's overseas territories in any future trade deal that's agreed.
And the UK also perhaps a good example of where political will might come into this, because as we've been saying, it's the member states that are approving who goes on this list. I know that when you went for a meeting in the UK, the British Treasury didn't actually send the relevant officials to one of your meetings to be able to answer the questions. Well,
we've had two committees in sequence here. So the Taxa Committee went to London, and we went to the Treasury, and we met the Chief Secretary, and we had discussions with the tax officials and so on. The second time, after the Brexit vote, nobody came from the government at all. We had to actually meet in Europe House because we didn't have any kind of official meeting place on British soil, which I thought was really shocking and very rude. But it does hint at maybe something about what Brexit's all about here, because maybe part of that is wishing to avoid some of these tax rules. We know that some of the key Brexiteers, like Lord Ashcroft, for example, like a number of them actually are people who themselves are involved in offshore. So it does make you raise questions about what's actually going on with Brexit.
Of course, the UK in time will no longer be a member state of the EU. However, there is a lot going on in the EU's own backyard, if I can put it that way. In your report, Malta, Luxembourg, the Netherlands kept coming up time and again as countries where tax practices are sort of just not what they should be. Malta, for example, coming in for particular criticism. Why aren't these countries apparently having more action taken against them?
Well, I think that in these countries there are elements in their tax policy and overall behavior in relation to taxation which raises questions. I wouldn't describe them simply as tax havens. I think they do not match all the criteria of the blacklist for the third countries tax havens. But I think there are some elements. For example, in Malta, we we're not sure, to put it mildly, that the authorities are independent of political influence when it came to tax matters and some investigations.
And that damages relations with other EU member states. I mean, that is pretty serious, surely. Shouldn't that be taken more seriously?
It does, and I think that as the Panama Papers and other revelations have garnered a certain momentum, I hope also the work of our committee, also some member states started to be more active against unfair tax practices. And I think that sooner or later we will exert the pressure on the problematic member states, the parliament, other member states, and hopefully also public opinion in these countries.
Well, we've talked about the blacklist, of course, putting people on a list, that's one thing, but actually taking action, sanctions, what can be done against transgressors, you know, naming and shaming, tightening up regulations. Molly Scott-Cato, what would you prefer?
Well, just to take up the point Peter was making, I think the political point here is that we as the Parliament are making these strong recommendations, and we've had very good support from Commissioner Moscovici as well, but the blockages keep coming in the Council because what the corporations are doing at the moment and wealthy people is essentially, you know, bidding countries against each other, getting them to compete with each other in a race to the bottom. And that's what we've got to stop. We've got to persuade national governments to work together in the interest of all the citizens of Europe. And so I think some of the people that need to be looked at, as well as companies where we say they shouldn't be able to set up in another country unless they have economic substance to stop the letterbox companies, but we really need to look at the intermediaries as well, and we really need to be looking at withdrawing their licenses if they're involved in deliberate tax avoidance. I think that's important, and also stopping EU funds going to these tax havens and saying that companies that have subsidiaries in offshore tax havens, for example, can't receive European funds and can't be eligible for procurement and contracts from the European institutions.
But of course, we don't want to discourage business from happening at all. Economic activity does still need to carry on, and financial services is an important part of the European economy. I mean, how far is too far with sanctions? How easy is it to find that right spot of sanctioning transgressors but still allowing business to continue?
Well, when it comes to the third countries, I think that we've seen already that naming and shaming being listed, it means a lot, but I think that definitely the member states should agree on sanctions. They can be some additional withholding tax. It can be if the countries are eligible to get money from EU funds, it can be made conditional to not being on the list, and similar sanctions. But when it comes to the member states, that's a different situation, and that's why, of course, I do not advocate the views that also member states should be scrutinized in this list of uncooperative tax jurisdiction. I think there should be another scrutiny for member states. It's being taken place in the sort of code of conduct, but it doesn't work very well because, as Molly says, the member states covers each other, and it should be improved and be more transparent. That's our, I think, joint effort.
Just a very quick word from you, Molly. Is that far enough for you?
Just to say,
or
on
do we
business,
want anarchy?
I mean, we have seen Commissioner Vestager launch some investigations into companies that she thinks are avoiding tax, because we want to see good business. We want to see business that actually focuses on innovation and pays its dues so that they can have the services they need. But what we don't want to see is businesses basically encouraging companies to compete with each other to get them preferential tax rates, because if that happens, we can't afford to fund the public services. They won't have the educated employees and the infrastructure systems, the roads and the Wi-Fi that they need to do their business. So it's actually in business's interest to make sure we have a proper tax system as well.
All right, well, we'll have to see where this all moves on to, but a very thorough report that both of you worked on for a year and a half or so. Thank you very much for coming in to discuss that with us on Talking Europe. Peter Ježek and Molly Scott-Cato, MEP.
Thank you.
And just time for us to bring you our latest check on the big fake news circulating about Europe and the European Union currently. It is time for Fact or Fake.
In October, on a main talk show about politics in France, Marine Le Pen, leader of the far-right National Front, declared that 80% of French laws were actually just European directives. We should first ask her what type of calculator she used to get such results, and ask the same question to all those pretending the same type of numbers. Some experts accepted this difficult challenge and were able to produce three main statements. First statement: compared with the total of EU directives and regulations, the actual proportion of national laws coming from EU levels varies from 15 to 30% depending on the country and time period. Second statement: there are huge sectorial differences. In agriculture, environment or financial services, between 1/3 and half of the norms can come from EU level. But in housing, culture or security, we are close to 0%. Finally, only a quarter of the European directives are implemented in France via law. The rest covers technical details, such as the shapes of the bananas, and it's implemented via executive orders by the administration and not by the members of parliament. France is then free to write as many laws it wishes, and by the way, it does not refrain from doing so.
And that brings us to the end of the programme. Thanks very much for watching. Thanks once again to our guests, Molly Scott-Cato and Peter Ježek. We'll see you in part 2 of Talking Europe. Do stay tuned.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
In January 2011, thousands of Egyptians converged on Tahrir Square to protest against a society riddled with corruption and police violence. After days of demonstrations, some 850 people were killed and thousands injured. The regime fell. Today, citizens are plagued by the economic crisis. Politics has taken a backseat. Some Egyptians don't want to forget. They're sharing their revolutionary experience with new generations.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.